The frozen ground beneath Gray's knees bit through her worn woolen dress as she knelt before the longhouse's great hearth, her swollen belly pressing against her thighs. The fire cast dancing shadows across the carved wooden beams above, where runes she couldn't read seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Around her, the Viking warriors sat in their carved chairs, their faces hard as the winter stone outside, watching her with eyes that held secrets darker than the December night. Douglas Gonzalez leaned forward from his place at the head of the long table, his scarred hands gripping a horn of ale. The Jarl's voice carried the weight of authority and something else, something that made Deborah's skin crawl despite the warmth from the fire. You understand the terms, widow. You serve through the winter months, tend our hearth, prepare our meals, mend our clothes. In return, we provide shelter for you and the child you carry. Deborah's fingers trembled as she pressed them against the rough wooden floor. 6 months pregnant and with nowhere else to turn after her husband's death in the autumn raids, she had little choice. The other women in the settlement had whispered warnings, told her that no woman had ever completed a full winter's service in the Longhouse. They spoke of strange disappearances, of women who simply vanished when the snows grew deepest. But with her belly growing larger each day and the harsh Norse winter closing in, Deborah had no other options. I understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Anthony Myers, the Jarl's second-in-command, shifted in his seat, his weathered face unreadable. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, it caught the firelight, and Deborah noticed how his hand never strayed far from the hilt of his sword. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of what might have been concern or warning, but it passed too quickly for her to be certain. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The other warriors, Eugene Thompson and Benjamin Garcia, exchanged glances across the table. Eugene's massive frame filled his chair, his red beard braided with small bones that clinked softly when he moved. Benjamin, younger but no less dangerous, drummed his fingers against the table's surface in a rhythm that seemed to match the wind howling outside the longhouse walls. Frank Green, the eldest of the group, sat in the shadows near the far end of the table. His white hair hung in thin braids, and his pale eyes never seemed to blink as they watched Deborah. There was something ancient and unsettling about his presence, as if he carried knowledge that predated the very stones of the Longhouse itself. Rise, woman, Douglas commanded, and Deborah struggled to her feet, one hand supporting her lower back as the weight of her pregnancy made the simple movement difficult. Your quarters are in the back chamber. You'll find what you need there. Your duties begin at dawn. As Deborah made her way toward the rear of the longhouse, she felt their eyes following her every step. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet, and she could hear the low murmur of voices behind her, speaking in the old tongue that she didn't understand. The words sounded like incantations, dark and rhythmic, and they made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The chamber they had given her was small and sparse, containing only a narrow bed covered with rough furs, a wooden chest, and a small window that looked out onto the snow-covered courtyard. Deborah sank onto the bed, her hands instinctively moving to cradle her belly. The baby kicked, as if sensing her distress, and she whispered soft words of comfort, more to herself than to the child she carried. 3 months earlier, Deborah had been the wife of a respected fisherman in the coastal village of Ravens Hollow. Her husband, Harold, had been chosen to join the autumn raids, an honor that would have brought wealth and status to their growing family. She had kissed him goodbye on a crisp September morning, her belly just beginning to show the first signs of her pregnancy, and watched his longship disappear beyond the horizon. The news of his death had come with the first winter storms. A survivor, more dead than alive, had staggered into the village with tales of a battle gone wrong, of ships lost to treacherous seas, and warriors claimed by foreign swords. Harold's body had never been recovered, leaving Deborah with nothing but memories and the child growing within her. The villagers had been kind at first, offering food and shelter, but as the weeks passed and her pregnancy advanced, their charity had grown thin. Resources were scarce in the best of times, and a pregnant widow was seen as a burden rather than an asset. When Douglas Gonzalez had arrived in Ravens Hollow, seeking a woman to serve in his longhouse through the winter months, the village elders had been quick to suggest Deborah. Now, lying on the narrow bed in the longhouse chamber, Deborah wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The stories the women had told her seemed more real in this place, surrounded by shadows and the constant sound of wind through the wooden walls. They spoke of women who had started the winter strong and healthy, only to grow pale and weak as the months progressed. They told of strange ceremonies conducted in the depths of winter, of blood spilled on ancient stones, of bargains made with powers older than the Christian God. Sleep came fitfully that first night, broken by dreams of dark water and the sound of her husband's voice calling to her from across an impossible distance. When dawn finally crept through the small window, Deborah rose stiffly from the bed and made her way to the main hall to begin her duties. The Longhouse was already stirring with activity. Douglas sat at the head table, breaking his fast with chunks of dark bread and salted fish. The other warriors were scattered throughout the hall, some still sleeping off the previous night's ale, others preparing for the day's activities. The fire in the great hearth had burned low during the night, and Deborah's first task was to build it back to a proper blaze. As she knelt before the hearth, feeding dried wood to the glowing embers, Anthony Myers approached. Up close, she could see that his scar was old and deep, the mark of a blade that had come very close to ending his life. His presence was intimidating, but there was something in his manner that seemed less threatening than the others. "You know how to tend a proper fire?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Deborah nodded, not trusting her voice. She had managed her own hearth for 3 years of marriage, and the skill had not left her. "Good. The fire must never die completely, not during the winter months. It's more important than you might think." His words carried a weight that suggested deeper meaning, but before Deborah could ask what he meant, he had moved away to join the others. The days that followed settled into a routine of sorts. Deborah rose before dawn to tend the fire and prepare the morning meal. She spent her days cleaning the longhouse, mending clothes and gear, and preparing the elaborate evening feast that the warriors seemed to require. The work was hard, made more difficult by her advancing pregnancy, but it was honest labor, and she found a certain comfort in the familiar rhythms of domestic life. Yet there were things about the longhouse that troubled her. Strange symbols carved into the wooden beams that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. Rooms that remained locked, their heavy wooden doors bound with iron and marked with runes that hurt her eyes to look upon. And always the feeling that she was being watched, evaluated, measured against some standard she didn't understand. The warriors themselves were an enigma. During the day, they went about their business with the efficiency of men accustomed to violence and hardship. They maintained their weapons, planned raids for the coming spring, and conducted the various affairs of their small domain. But at night, when the ale flowed and the fire burned high, they would speak in the old tongue, their voices taking on a rhythmic, almost ceremonial quality. Eugene Thompson was the most straightforward of the group, a giant of a man whose strength was legendary even among the Vikings. He treated Deborah with a rough kindness, often helping her move heavy pots or carry wood for the fire. His presence was reassuring in its simplicity, a reminder that not everything in the longhouse was shrouded in mystery. Benjamin Garcia was younger, perhaps only a few years older than Deborah herself. He had the restless energy of a man who had seen battle but not yet grown weary of it. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression that might have been sympathy, but he never spoke to her beyond the necessities of daily life. Frank Green remained the most unsettling of the warriors. Ancient beyond his apparent years, he seemed to know things that others did not. He would appear silently in rooms where Deborah was working, studying her with those pale, unblinking eyes before disappearing just as quietly. When he spoke, which was rarely, his words carried the weight of prophecy and threat in equal measure. It was Douglas Gonzalez who commanded them all, and it was Douglas who made Deborah's skin crawl with unease. The Jarl was not an unattractive man, his features strong and well-formed, his body still powerful despite his middle years. But there was something in his eyes, a hunger that went beyond physical desire, that made Deborah careful never to be alone with him. As the weeks passed and her belly grew larger, Deborah began to notice changes in the longhouse's atmosphere. The warriors grew more restless as the winter deepened, their conversations more secretive, their glances in her direction more frequent and meaningful. She found herself thinking often of the women who had served here before her, wondering what had become of them, and whether their disappearances had been as mysterious as the village gossips claimed. The first real sign that something was amiss came in early December, when the snows had grown deep enough to block the mountain passes. Deborah was in the kitchen preparing the evening meal when she heard voices from the main hall speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Creeping closer to the doorway, she strained to make out their words. "The time approaches," Douglas was saying, his voice heavy with anticipation. "The child will be born within the month, if I judge correctly." "Are you certain she's the one?" This was Frank Green, his ancient voice crackling like dry leaves. "The signs must be precise. There can be no mistakes, not with something of this magnitude." "The bloodline is correct," Douglas replied. "I've traced it back 5 generations. Her husband's family carries the old blood, the line that stretches back to the first settlements. The child she carries will have the proper heritage." Anthony Meyer spoke next, and Deborah was surprised by the reluctance in his tone. "There are other ways. We don't have to follow the old customs. The world has changed since our grandfather's time." "The world may change," Frank Green said, his voice taking on a lecturing quality. "But the old powers remain. They hunger for what they have always hungered for. Blood calls to blood, and the ancient debts must be paid." Deborah's hand went instinctively to her belly, and she felt the baby kick as if responding to her sudden fear. Whatever they were discussing, it involved her child, and the tone of their conversation left no doubt that their intentions were far from benevolent. She crept back to the kitchen, her mind racing as she tried to process what she had overheard. The old blood, ancient debts, the proper heritage. These phrases echoed in her thoughts as she mechanically continued her food preparation. Her husband Harold had never spoken of his family's history beyond the usual tales of Viking ancestors and glorious battles. Could there be something in his bloodline that these men coveted? Something that made her unborn child valuable to them in ways she couldn't comprehend? That night, as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind howl through the Longhouse walls, Deborah made a decision. She would find out what the warriors were planning, and if necessary, she would find a way to escape before her child was born. The thought of fleeing into the harsh winter landscape with no resources and nowhere to go was terrifying, but the alternative, based on what she had overheard, might be far worse. The opportunity to learn more came sooner than expected. The next evening, as Deborah was cleaning the great hall after the warriors had retired to their private chambers, she noticed that one of the locked doors stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see flickering candlelight and hear the low murmur of voices engaged in some kind of ritual or ceremony. Moving as quietly as her pregnant form would allow, Deborah crept closer to the door. The voices were chanting now, speaking words in the old tongue that seemed to make the very air around her vibrate with malevolent energy. Through the crack in the door, she could see into a chamber she had never entered it before. The room was circular, its walls lined with ancient stones covered in carved runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. In the center of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, its surface stained dark with what could only be old blood. Around the altar, the 5 warriors stood in a circle, their faces painted with strange symbols, their voices rising and falling in hypnotic rhythm. On the altar lay objects that made Deborah's blood run cold: a curved dagger with a bone handle, a chalice made from what looked like a human skull, and bundles of herbs that filled the air with a sickly sweet smoke. But it was the carved wooden cradle beside the altar that truly terrified her, its small size making clear what kind of sacrifice these men intended to make. As she watched in horrified fascination, Douglas raised the bone-handled dagger above his head, and the chanting reached a crescendo. The runes on the walls seemed to flare brighter, and for a moment, Deborah could have sworn she saw shapes moving in the shadows. Things that were not quite human, but possessed of a terrible intelligence and hunger. "The compact remains unbroken," Douglas intoned, his voice echoing strangely in the circular chamber. "As our fathers before us, and their fathers before them, we honor the old agreements. Blood for power, life for life. The cycle continues unbroken." Frank Green stepped forward, his ancient voice adding to the ritual. "The bloodline has been preserved, carefully tended through the generations. The child that comes will carry the proper heritage, will serve the proper purpose. The old ones will be satisfied, and our strength will be renewed for another generation. Deborah felt sick as the full implication of their words became clear. They had not simply offered her shelter out of charity or even practical need. They had specifically sought her out, knowing of her pregnancy, knowing of her husband's bloodline, planning from the beginning to use her child in some horrific ritual sacrifice. The baby kicked violently within her womb, as if sensing the danger, and Deborah pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp of pain and fear. She had to get away, had to find some means of escape before her child was born, and these madmen could carry out their terrible plan. But as she began to back away from the door, her foot caught against a loose floorboard, and the resulting creak echoed through the chamber like thunder. The chanting stopped abruptly, and 5 pairs of eyes turned toward the doorway where she crouched in the shadows. "It seems our guest has developed an unfortunate curiosity," Douglas said, his voice carrying a note of dark amusement. "Bring her in. It's time she understood her true purpose here." Strong hands seized Deborah's arms, and she found herself dragged into the ritual chamber despite her struggles. The painted faces of the warriors loomed over her in the flickering candlelight, and she could smell the metallic scent of old blood mixed with the cloying smoke of burning herbs. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own racing heartbeat. "Please don't hurt my baby." Douglas knelt beside her, his scarred face wearing an expression of what might have been genuine regret. "The child will serve a greater purpose than you can imagine, Deborah Gray. Through its sacrifice, we maintain our compact with powers that have protected our people for centuries. Its death will ensure the survival of dozens, perhaps hundreds of others." "You're insane," Deborah gasped, struggling against the hands that held her. "This is madness, devil worship, not the way of civilized people." Frank Green laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "Civilized people huddle in their villages, praying to their weak god, while raiders burn their homes and steal their children. We have made different choices, formed different alliances. The old powers demand their due, but they protect those who serve them faithfully." Anthony Meyer stepped forward, and Deborah was surprised to see conflict in his scarred features. "There might be another way," he said quietly. "The old texts speak of alternatives, of other forms of tribute that might satisfy the compact." "No," Douglas said firmly. "The bloodline is too pure, the opportunity too perfect. We will not risk the anger of the old ones by offering substitutes when we have the genuine article within our grasp." As the warriors continued their debate, Deborah's mind raced, searching for any possible means of escape. The ritual chamber had no other exits that she could see, and even if she could somehow break free from her captors, her advanced pregnancy would make flight through the winter landscape nearly impossible. But as she looked around the chamber, her eyes fell upon something that offered a glimmer of hope. Near the base of the altar, partially hidden by shadow, she could see what appeared to be a narrow opening in the floor, perhaps a drainage channel or storage space. If she could somehow reach it, it might provide a hiding place or even a means of escape. The opportunity came when Eugene Thompson, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings, moved toward the chamber door. "I need air," he muttered, his massive frame blocking the doorway as he stepped outside. In that moment of distraction, as the other warriors turned to watch him leave, Deborah threw herself sideways, breaking free from the hands that held her and rolling toward the altar. The stone floor was cold and hard against her body, and the impact sent pain shooting through her swollen belly. But desperation gave her strength, and she managed to squeeze herself into the narrow opening she had spotted, pulling her legs up just as Douglas lunged after her. The space was cramped and dark, barely wide enough for her pregnant form, but it seemed to extend back into the foundation of the Longhouse. Behind her, she could hear the warriors shouting, their voices echoing strangely in the ritual chamber. Douglas was cursing in both Norse and the common tongue, demanding that she come out immediately. "You only delay the inevitable," Frank Green called after her, his ancient voice carrying easily through the narrow space. "The child will be born soon, and when it is, you will have no choice but to emerge. Better to accept your fate with dignity than to suffer needlessly in that cramped hole." But Deborah had no intention of accepting any fate these madmen had planned for her. Inch by painful inch, she worked her way deeper into the narrow passage, following it as it curved beneath the Longhouse foundation. The air was stale and cold, filled with the scent of earth and old stone, but it was better than the cloying smoke of the ritual chamber. Behind her, she could hear the warriors attempting to follow, but the passage was too narrow for their larger frames. Douglas was shouting orders, sending men to search for other entrances to the underground space. But for the moment, Deborah was beyond their immediate reach. The passage seemed to extend for a considerable distance, sometimes widening enough for her to crawl more comfortably, other times narrowing until she had to squeeze through gaps that scraped against her swollen belly. She had no idea where it might lead, but any destination was preferable to the ritual chamber and its blood-stained altar. As she crawled through the darkness, Deborah found herself thinking of Harold, remembering the stories he had told her about his family's history. His grandfather had been a warrior of some renown, his great-grandfather before him a jarl who had ruled over several settlements. Could there really be something in his bloodline that made their unborn child valuable to these cultists? Some genetic heritage that stretched back to the earliest days of Viking settlement? The passage began to slope upward, and Deborah could feel a faint current of fresh air against her face. Somewhere ahead, there had to be an opening to the outside world. The thought gave her renewed strength, and she pushed forward despite the growing pain in her back and the increasingly frequent contractions that gripped her belly. When she finally emerged from the passage, it was into a small cave cut into the hillside behind the Longhouse. Snow had drifted across the entrance, but she could see the pale light of dawn filtering through the white barrier. She had been crawling through the underground passage for hours, and the new day was beginning. The cave was small but dry, offering some protection from the wind and snow. More importantly, it seemed to be unknown to the warriors who were hunting her. From outside, she could hear their voices calling her name, but they sounded distant, as if they were searching in the wrong direction. Deborah huddled in the back of the cave, wrapping her arms around her swollen belly as another contraction gripped her. The baby was coming, she realized, with a mixture of fear and determination. Whether she wanted it or not, her child would be born today, in this cold cave, far from the warmth and safety she had hoped to provide. As the contractions grew stronger and more frequent, Deborah tried to prepare herself for what was to come. She had no midwife, no clean cloths, no warm water, none of the things that were considered essential for a safe birth. But women had been giving birth in far worse conditions for thousands of years, and she would find a way to bring her child safely into the world. The labor was long and difficult, made worse by the cold and her fear of discovery. Several times she heard the warriors passing near the cave entrance, their voices carrying clearly in the crisp winter air. They were still searching for her, but so far none had thought to look in the small cave hidden behind the drifted snow. When her daughter finally arrived, it was with a rush of pain and relief that left Deborah gasping and exhausted. The baby was small but healthy, her cries echoing in the confines of the cave like a song of defiance against the darkness that had threatened to claim her. Deborah wrapped her daughter in the torn fabric of her underdress, holding her close to her body for warmth. The child had Harold's dark hair and her own green eyes, and looking down at her perfect features, Deborah felt a fierce protectiveness that gave her new strength. "They will not have you," she whispered to the baby, her voice trembling with emotion. "Whatever dark purpose they intended, whatever ancient compact they served, you will not be part of it. You are my daughter, Harold's daughter, and you will grow up free." But even as she spoke the words, Deborah knew that their situation remained desperate. She was weak from the birth, bleeding and exhausted, trapped in a cave with a newborn infant while dangerous men searched for them outside. The winter landscape offered no shelter, no help, no hope of rescue. It was then that she heard footsteps approaching the cave entrance, and her heart sank as she recognized Douglas Gonzalez's voice calling her name. They had found her hiding place at last, and she had nowhere left to run. "Deborah Gray," Douglas called, his voice carrying a note of false kindness that made her skin crawl. "We know you're in there. Come out now, and we'll make this easy for both you and the child. Continue to resist, and things will become much more difficult." Deborah pressed herself against the back wall of the cave, clutching her daughter to her chest. The baby had stopped crying, as if sensing the danger, and lay quiet and warm against her mother's body. Through the cave entrance, Deborah could see shadows moving in the snow, the shapes of men positioning themselves to prevent any possible escape. The child has been born, Frank Green's ancient voice added, carrying the weight of centuries. I can sense it, can feel the new life that has entered the world. The bloodline is complete, the sacrifice ready. Do not make us come in after you, woman. It will go better for you if you surrender willingly. But surrender was not an option that Deborah could accept. Whatever these men intended for her daughter, whatever ancient ritual they planned to perform, she would fight them with every breath in her body. The thought of her innocent child being harmed gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. From deeper in the cave system, she heard a sound that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Footsteps, but coming from the wrong direction, from somewhere behind her rather than from the entrance. Someone else was in the caves, someone who had found a different way in. The footsteps grew closer and Deborah tensed, preparing to defend her child against this new threat. But when the figure emerged from the shadows, she gasped in recognition. It was Anthony Myers. His scarred face grim, but his eyes holding something that looked almost like compassion. "Quickly," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "There's another way out, but we have to move now before the others realize I'm not with them." Deborah stared at him in confusion and suspicion. "Why would you help me? You're one of them." Anthony's expression darkened, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. "I've seen too much blood spilled in the name of the old ways," he said quietly. "Too many innocents sacrificed to powers that care nothing for human suffering. I won't be part of it anymore." Outside the cave, Douglas was growing impatient. "We're coming in, Deborah. Make this easy on yourself." Anthony moved closer, his voice urgent. "The passage I came through leads to the old mine workings. From there, you can reach the valley road. It's dangerous in winter, but it's your only chance." Deborah looked into his scarred face, searching for any sign of deception. But all she saw was weariness and a genuine desire to help. "What about you? What will happen when they find out you helped me?" "That's not your concern," Anthony replied, already moving toward the back of the cave. "Come on, we don't have much time." Clutching her daughter close, Deborah followed Anthony into the deeper passages of the cave system. Behind them, she could hear the other warriors entering the outer cave, their voices echoing angrily as they discovered her absence. The passage Anthony led her through was older and more natural than the one she had used to escape the Longhouse, carved by water and time rather than human hands. It twisted and turned through the hillside, sometimes opening into larger chambers, other times narrowing to barely passable cracks in the rock. As they moved through the darkness, Anthony spoke in low tones, explaining what she would face once she reached the outside world. "The valley road leads to Thornwick, about 20 miles south. It's a hard journey in good weather, nearly impossible in winter, but there are way station huts along the route. If you can reach them, you might have a chance." "What about food, supplies?" Deborah asked, her voice weak from exhaustion and blood loss. Anthony pressed a leather pouch into her hands. "Dried meat, hard bread, enough for a few days if you're careful. There's also a small knife and some silver coins. It's not much, but it's all I could manage without arousing suspicion." They reached a natural chamber where several passages converged, and Anthony stopped, listening carefully to the sounds echoing from the tunnels around them. "They're following," he said grimly. "Douglas is persistent, and Frank knows these caves better than anyone. You'll have to move fast once you reach the surface." "Come with me," Deborah said impulsively. "Leave this place. Leave them behind. You don't have to be part of their madness." Anthony shook his head, a sad smile crossing his scarred features. "My path was set long ago, when I first took their oath and participated in their rituals. I can help you escape, but I can't escape myself. The old powers have too strong a hold on me." He led her to a narrow opening that showed a glimpse of gray winter sky. "This comes out near the tree line about a mile from the valley road. Keep the sun on your right as you travel, and you should reach the first way station before nightfall." As Deborah prepared to squeeze through the opening, she turned back to Anthony one last time. "Why are you doing this? Really?" The scarred warrior was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. "I had a daughter once," he said finally. "She would be about your age now if she had lived. The old ones demanded her life as part of their compact, and I was too weak, too bound by oath and tradition to refuse them. I won't let that happen again. Not if I can prevent it. Understanding flooded through Deborah, along with a deep sadness for this man who had lost so much to the dark traditions he served. Thank you, she whispered, then squeezed through the opening and into the cold winter air. The landscape that greeted her was harsh and unforgiving, a wilderness of snow and bare trees stretching as far as the eye could see. The wind cut through her torn dress like a blade, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each step. But her daughter was warm against her chest, and the thought of the child's future gave her the will to continue. Behind her, she could hear shouts echoing from the cave system as the warriors discovered Anthony's betrayal. The sounds grew fainter as she made her way down the hillside, but she knew they would not give up easily. Douglas and his followers had invested too much in their dark plan to let her escape without a fight. The journey to the valley road was a nightmare of cold and exhaustion. Deborah's body was still weak from childbirth, and the blood loss made every step a struggle. Several times she stumbled and nearly fell, only her determination to protect her daughter keeping her upright and moving forward. When she finally reached the road, it was little more than a track through the snow, barely visible beneath the winter drifts. But it was a path, a way forward, and she followed it south with grim determination. The baby remained quiet against her chest, occasionally stirring to nurse, but otherwise seeming to understand that silence was essential to their survival. The first way station appeared as the winter sun was beginning to set, a small stone hut with smoke rising from its chimney. Deborah approached cautiously, unsure who might be inside, but the cold was becoming unbearable, and her daughter needed warmth and shelter. The door opened at her knock to reveal an elderly woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," the woman gasped, taking in Deborah's bedraggled appearance and the bundle she carried. "Come in, child. Come in before you freeze to death." The interior of the way station was simple but warm, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a pot of stew simmering over the flames. The woman, who introduced herself as Sharon Harris, helped Deborah to a chair by the fire and immediately began fussing over both mother and child. "What are you doing out in weather like this with a newborn?" Sharon asked as she wrapped warm blankets around them both. "Are you running from something, dear?" Deborah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. The truth sounded like madness, and she had no idea whether this kind woman would believe her stories of ritual sacrifice and ancient compacts. "My husband died in the raids," she said finally. "I was staying with some of his kinsmen, but things became difficult. I had to leave." Sharon's eyes showed understanding and sympathy. She had clearly seen enough of the world to know that women sometimes face dangers that had nothing to do with weather or wild animals. "Well, you're safe here for now," she said firmly. "Rest and get your strength back. We'll figure out what to do next in the morning." That night, as Deborah lay in the narrow bed with her daughter sleeping peacefully beside her, she allowed herself to hope that the worst might be behind them. They had escaped the Longhouse and its dark secrets, found shelter and kindness, and her daughter was healthy and strong despite the circumstances of her birth. But her hope was shattered in the early hours of the morning when she was awakened by the sound of horses approaching the way station. Through the small window, she could see torches moving in the darkness, and she recognized the voice calling out in the Norse tongue. Douglas had found them. Sharon Harris appeared at her bedside, already dressed and moving with the efficiency of someone accustomed to danger. "There's a root cellar beneath the floor," she whispered urgently. "Take the baby and hide there. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "I can't let you face them alone," Deborah protested. But the older woman was already pushing her toward a hidden trapdoor in the corner of the room. "I've dealt with men like this before," Sharon said grimly. "They won't hurt an old woman, especially one who claims to know nothing. But they'll kill you and take the child if they find you here." Deborah descended into the root cellar with her daughter, pulling the trapdoor closed above them, just as heavy fists began pounding on the way station door. The space was cramped and cold, filled with the scent of stored vegetables and preserved meat, but it offered concealment, and that was all that mattered. Through the wooden floor above, she could hear Sharon opening the door and speaking to the warriors in a voice that perfectly conveyed confused innocence. "Goodness me, what brings you out on such a terrible night? Come in, warm yourselves by the fire. Douglas's voice was polite but implacable. "We're searching for a pregnant woman who may have given birth recently. She's traveling with dangerous criminals, and we fear for her safety." "Oh my," Sharon replied, her tone suggesting genuine concern. "How terrible. But I haven't seen anyone like that, I'm afraid. I've been alone here for days." "You wouldn't mind if we searched the station, would you?" This was Frank Green's ancient voice, carrying undertones that suggested the question was not really a request. "Of course not," Sharon said smoothly. "Though I'm not sure what you expect to find. It's not a very large place." Deborah held her breath as heavy footsteps moved around the room above her head. The warriors were being thorough, checking every corner, every possible hiding place. At one point, someone walked directly over the trapdoor, and she was certain they would discover the hidden entrance to the cellar. But Sharon had prepared for such searches. The trapdoor was cunningly concealed, and the old woman kept up a steady stream of chatter that distracted the warriors from their examination of the floor. She offered them food and drink, asked about their travels, and generally played the part of a lonely old woman grateful for company. After what seemed like hours, the footsteps moved toward the door. "If you do see this woman," Douglas said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "you should know that she's dangerous, mentally unstable. She's already killed one man and threatened others. If she appears here, send word immediately." "Oh, I certainly will," Sharon replied, her voice conveying perfect sincerity. "How awful to think such a person might be wandering about. I'll be sure to bar my door extra carefully tonight." The warriors left, but Deborah remained in the cellar for another hour, waiting until Sharon gave the all-clear signal they had agreed upon. When she finally emerged, she found the older woman sitting calmly by the fire, sipping tea as if nothing had happened. "They'll be back," Sharon said without preamble. "Maybe not tonight, but soon. You can't stay here." "Where can I go?" Deborah asked desperately. "They seem to be able to track me wherever I run." Sharon studied her thoughtfully. "There's a convent about 50 miles east of here, in the mountains. The sisters there don't ask questions about a woman's past, and they have ways of protecting those who need sanctuary. It's a hard journey, especially in winter, but it might be your best chance." The next morning, Sharon provided Deborah with warmer clothes, additional food, and most importantly, a detailed map showing the route to the mountain convent. "Follow the old pilgrim trail," she instructed, tracing the path with her finger. "It's longer than the main roads, but less traveled. There are shelter caves marked along the way, places where you can rest and hide if necessary." As Deborah prepared to leave, Sharon pressed a small wooden cross into her hands. "The sisters will recognize this," she said. "It will tell them that you come seeking sanctuary, not just shelter. They'll protect you and the child, no matter what those men claim about you." The journey into the mountains was even more difficult than the escape from the Longhouse had been. The pilgrim trail was ancient and poorly maintained, often disappearing entirely beneath the snowdrifts. Deborah had to rely on landmarks, following stone markers and carved symbols that had guided travelers for centuries. Her daughter, whom she had decided to name Hannah after her own grandmother, seemed to thrive despite the harsh conditions. The baby nursed regularly and slept peacefully against her mother's chest, wrapped in the warm furs that Sharon had provided. Sometimes, when the wind died down and the sun broke through the clouds, Deborah could almost believe they were simply on a normal journey to visit relatives or attend a festival. But the reality of their situation was never far from her mind. Several times during the first 2 days of travel, she spotted riders in the distance, dark figures moving across the snow-covered landscape with the persistence of hunting wolves. Whether they were Douglas and his followers or simply other travelers, she couldn't tell, but she took no chances, hiding in the marked caves until the riders had passed from sight. The shelter caves were a blessing, small natural formations that had been improved over the years by countless pilgrims. Each contained a supply of dried wood, basic cooking implements, and sometimes even preserved food left by previous travelers. The unwritten law of the trail was that each person took only what they needed and left something for those who would come after. On the third day, as Deborah was approaching one of the larger shelter caves marked on her map, she heard voices coming from within. Her heart sank as she recognized the Norse accent, the particular cadence of speech that marked Douglas and his followers. Somehow they had gotten ahead of her on the trail, Creeping closer, she could make out their conversation through the cave entrance. They were discussing their search, debating whether to continue following the pilgrim trail or return to check the main roads. Eugene Thompson's voice carried clearly in the cold air, expressing doubts about their mission. "Maybe we should let her go," the giant warrior was saying. "She's just a woman with a baby, trying to survive. There are other bloodlines, other ways to satisfy the compact." "No," Douglas replied firmly. "The signs were too clear, the opportunity too perfect. That child carries the pure bloodline we've been seeking for generations. Without the proper sacrifice, our protection will fail, and everything our ancestors built will crumble." Frank Green's ancient voice added weight to the argument. "The old ones grow impatient. They have honored their part of the bargain for centuries, granting us strength in battle, protection from our enemies, prosperity in our endeavors. But they demand their due, and they will not be denied much longer." Benjamin Garcia spoke next, his younger voice carrying uncertainty. "What if the woman reaches the convent? The Christian sisters won't hand her over, no matter what we tell them." "Then we'll take what we need by force," Douglas said coldly. "The sisters may claim sanctuary, but their walls won't stop determined men. One way or another, we'll have that child before the winter solstice." Deborah backed away from the cave entrance, her mind racing. The solstice was only days away, and apparently that was when they planned to perform their ritual sacrifice. She had to reach the convent before then, had to find safety behind walls that even these desperate men wouldn't dare breach. But as she prepared to continue up the trail, skirting around the occupied cave, a sound made her freeze in terror. Hannah had chosen that moment to wake up and begin crying, her infant voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The voices in the cave stopped abruptly, and Deborah heard the scrape of weapons being drawn. There was nowhere to hide on the exposed trail, nowhere to run that they wouldn't easily overtake her. After days of flight and hardship, it seemed her luck had finally run out. "Well, well, Douglas said as he emerged from the cave, his sword gleaming in the pale winter sunlight. "It seems our quarry has come to us. How convenient." The other warriors followed him out, forming a loose circle around Deborah and her crying daughter. There was no escape now, no clever hiding place or unexpected ally to save them. Hannah's cries grew louder, as if the baby sensed the danger surrounding them. "Please," Deborah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's just an innocent child. Whatever you think she represents, whatever purpose you believe she serves, she's done nothing wrong." Frank Green stepped forward, his pale eyes fixed on the bundle in Deborah's arms. "Innocence is precisely what makes the sacrifice valuable," he said in his crackling voice. "The old ones have no use for the corrupt or the tainted. They require purity, blood that has never known sin or compromise." "The winter solstice is 3 days away," Douglas added, his tone almost conversational. "We have time to return to the Longhouse, to prepare the proper ceremonies. Your daughter will serve a purpose greater than any ordinary life could provide." But even as the warriors closed in around them, Deborah heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Hoofbeats approaching fast along the trail from the direction of the convent. Someone was coming, and from the sound of it, there were several riders. The warriors heard it too, and Douglas cursed in the old tongue as he gestured for his men to take defensive positions. Whatever was approaching, they weren't taking any chances. The riders who appeared around the bend in the trail were not what any of them had expected. They were women, a dozen of them, dressed in the simple brown robes of the mountain convent, but armed with swords and crossbows like seasoned warriors. At their head rode a tall woman with graying hair and eyes like steel, her bearing suggesting both spiritual authority and military experience. "I am Mother Superior Hannah Powell," the lead rider announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute command. "You will release that woman and child immediately or face the consequences of violating sanctuary law." Douglas laughed, but there was uncertainty in the sound. "Sanctuary law applies within the walls of your convent, sister. Out here, you have no authority." "You're wrong," Mother Superior Powell replied calmly. "Our charter from the king grants us jurisdiction over this entire mountain region. Any crime committed here falls under our authority, and threatening a mother and child certainly qualifies as criminal behavior." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, neither side willing to back down. Douglas and his warriors outnumbered the convent sisters, but the women held the higher ground and had the advantage of crossbows that could strike at distance. More importantly, they had the authority of law and custom behind them, while the warriors were clearly in the wrong. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Frank Green said, his ancient voice carrying a note of warning. "This matter involves powers older than your Christian God, compacts that predate your kingdom by centuries. The child must fulfill her destiny." Mother Superior Powell's expression didn't change, but Deborah could see steel in her gray eyes. "The only destiny that concerns me is ensuring this woman and her baby reach safety. Your pagan superstitions have no power here." Eugene Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his massive frame tense with uncertainty. Of all the warriors, he seemed the most reluctant to engage in open combat with the convent sisters. "Perhaps we should reconsider," he said quietly to Douglas. "Fighting holy women will bring us nothing but trouble." "The compact must be honored," Douglas replied through gritted teeth, but Deborah could see doubt creeping into his expression. The appearance of the armed sisters had clearly disrupted whatever plan he had formed for capturing her and Hannah. Anthony Myers had been silent since the sisters arrived, but now he stepped forward, his scarred face grim with determination. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I've seen too much blood spilled in the name of the old ways. This ends now." Before anyone could react, Anthony drew a sword and placed himself between Deborah and the other warriors. The blade gleamed in the winter sunlight as he faced his former companions with steady resolve. "Anthony," Douglas said, his voice filled with shock and betrayal. "What are you doing? You swore the same oaths we all did. You're bound by the same compact." "I was," Anthony replied calmly, "but some oaths are meant to be broken when they demand the blood of innocents. I helped her escape once, and I'll do it again if necessary." The tension ratcheted even higher as the warriors found themselves facing not only the armed sisters, but also betrayal from within their own ranks. Benjamin Garcia and Eugene Thompson exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction events had taken. It was Frank Green who broke the stalemate, his ancient voice rising in what sounded like an incantation in the old tongue. The words seemed to make the very air around them vibrate with malevolent energy, and Deborah felt Hannah begin to cry again, as if the baby could sense the dark power being invoked. But Mother Superior Powell was ready for such tactics. She raised her own voice in Latin, speaking words of blessing and protection that seemed to push back against the Norse sorcery. The two spiritual forces clashed invisibly in the cold mountain air, and for a moment, the very stones beneath their feet seemed to tremble. "Your old gods have no power here," the Mother Superior declared, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. "This is consecrated ground, protected by faith that has endured for 1,000 years. Take your darkness and leave this place." Frank Green's incantation faltered, and Deborah saw surprise flicker across his ancient features. Whatever power he had tried to invoke had been turned aside by the Mother Superior's faith, leaving him looking suddenly old and frail, rather than mystically threatening. Douglas raised his sword, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "If we can't have the child through sorcery, we'll take her by force. The compact will be honored, whatever the cut." But as he prepared to charge, Anthony Myers moved to block his path. The two men had fought side by side for years, had shared countless battles and victories. But now they faced each other as enemies. Their swords met with a ringing clash that echoed off the mountain walls. The fight was brief but vicious. Anthony was skilled, but Douglas fought with the desperation of a man who saw his entire worldview crumbling around him. Steel rang against steel as they battled on the narrow trail, neither giving ground. It ended when Anthony, pressing forward in a complex attack pattern, left himself momentarily exposed. Douglas's blade found its mark, sliding between his ribs and into his heart. The scarred warrior looked down at the steel protruding from his chest with something that might have been relief. "The old ways die hard," he whispered, then collapsed to the frozen ground. Douglas stood over his fallen comrade, breathing heavily, his sword dripping blood onto the snow. But his moment of triumph was short-lived. The convent sisters had used the distraction of the duel to position themselves more advantageously, And now their crossbows were trained directly on him and his remaining men. "It's over," Mother Superior Powell said quietly. "Your friend is dead, and you're outnumbered. Leave now and we'll say no more about this incident. Stay and face the consequences of your actions." For a long moment, Douglas stared at her with eyes full of rage and defeat. The carefully laid plans of generations were crumbling, the ancient compact threatened by forces he couldn't overcome through violence or sorcery. Finally, with visible effort, he sheathed his sword. "This isn't finished," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The old ones will not be denied forever. They'll find another way, another bloodline, another sacrifice. The compact will be honored." "Perhaps," the Mother Superior replied calmly, "but not today, and not with this child." Douglas gestured to his remaining men, and they began to withdraw down the trail. Eugene Thompson cast one last look at Anthony's body, his expression unreadable. Benjamin Garcia seemed almost relieved to be leaving, while Frank Green muttered what sounded like curses in the old tongue. As the warriors disappeared around a bend in the trail, Mother Superior Powell dismounted and approached Deborah, who was still clutching Hannah protectively to her chest. The baby had stopped crying and was looking around with the bright curiosity of the very young. "You're safe now," the Mother Superior said gently, her stern demeanor softening as she looked at the exhausted mother and child. "No one will harm you within our walls." Deborah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the full weight of a relief hit her. After days of flight and terror, of constant fear for her daughter's life, they had finally found sanctuary. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Thank Anthony Myers," the Mother Superior replied, glancing at the fallen warrior. "His sacrifice made this possible. We'll see that he receives proper burial, regardless of the company he kept." As the convent sisters helped Deborah onto one of their horses, she took one last look at Anthony's still form. He had died to protect her and Hannah, had broken the oaths of a lifetime to ensure their safety. She would never forget his courage or the price he had paid for their freedom. The convent of St. Catherine stood like a fortress carved from the living rock of the mountain, its walls rising sheer from the cliff face to tower against the winter sky. As their small party approached the massive gates, Deborah felt a sense of security she hadn't experienced since before Harold's death. Here, behind these ancient stones, she and Hannah would be safe from Douglas Gonzalez and his dark purposes. The sisters who greeted them at the gate were a mixture of the scholarly and the practical, women who had chosen the religious life but hadn't forgotten the harsh realities of the world beyond their walls. They took charge of Deborah and Hannah with efficient kindness, providing warm rooms, clean clothes, and nourishing food without asking intrusive questions about their past. Mother Superior Powell assigned a young sister named Sharon Gray to serve as Deborah's primary caretaker. Sharon was perhaps 25 years old, with gentle brown eyes and capable hands that spoke of a life spent in service to others. She had joined the convent after her own husband's death in the border wars, and she understood the particular grief and vulnerability that came with sudden widowhood. "The Mother Superior told me something of your situation," Sharon said as she helped Deborah settle into her small but comfortable chamber. "You needn't worry about those men finding you here. Our walls have protected women for 3 centuries, and they'll protect you as well." That first night at the convent, Deborah slept more peacefully than she had since leaving Raven's Hollow. Hannah lay beside her in a proper cradle, warm and safe, occasionally stirring to nurse but otherwise content in the security of their new surroundings. The thick stone walls blocked out the winter wind, and the constant presence of the sisters provided a sense of community that Deborah hadn't realized how much she missed. But peace, she discovered, could be as difficult to adjust to as danger. After weeks of constant flight and fear, the sudden absence of immediate threat left her feeling strangely hollow. Her mind, no longer focused entirely on survival, began to process the full horror of what she had escaped. The ritual chamber with its blood-stained altar, the casual way the warriors had discussed sacrificing her child, the ancient evil that still lurked in the Longhouse, waiting for another opportunity. Sharon Gray proved to be more than just a caretaker. She became a friend and confidant. During the long winter evenings, as they sat by the fire in Deborah's chamber with Hannah sleeping peacefully between them, Sharon would listen without judgment, as Deborah slowly revealed the full story of her ordeal. "I've heard whispers of such things," Sharon said one evening after Deborah had described the ritual chamber. "The old religions didn't simply disappear when Christianity came to these lands. They went underground, became secret practices passed down through certain families. Most are harmless, just traditional ways of marking the seasons or honoring ancestors. But some," she shuddered, "some retain their darker aspects." "Do you think they'll try again?" Deborah asked, unconsciously pulling Hannah closer. "Douglas seems so certain that the compact required my daughter specifically." Sharon considered this carefully. "The Mother Superior has been in correspondence with the king's magistrates about the incident on the mountain. There will be consequences for Douglas and his followers, legal ones that even they won't be able to ignore. As for their religious beliefs, well, that's harder to address, but Hannah is safe here, and she'll remain safe as long as necessary." As winter deepened into its harshest months, life at the convent settled into comfortable routines. Deborah helped with various tasks around the community, her skills as a wife and mother making her useful in the kitchens and infirmary. Hannah thrived in the warm, protected environment, growing stronger and more alert each day. The sisters doted on the baby, and it wasn't uncommon to find one of them holding Hannah during prayer services, the infant's presence seeming to bring additional joy to their worship. But even in this sanctuary, reminders of the outside world occasionally intruded. Travelers brought news from the surrounding regions, and not all of it was reassuring. There were reports of strange happenings in the area around the Longhouse, of livestock found dead under mysterious circumstances, of young people disappearing during the darkest nights of winter. Mother Superior Powell shared some of these reports with Deborah during one of their regular meetings. "The magistrates sent investigators to examine the Longhouse," she said, her expression grave. "They found evidence of the ritual chamber you described, along with other disturbing artifacts. But Douglas Gonzalez and his followers had vanished. The entire compound was abandoned." "Where could they have gone?" Deborah asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Unknown, but there have been sightings of armed men in the deep forests, and several isolated farmsteads have reported visits from strangers asking about pregnant women or newborn children. It seems they haven't given up their search for a suitable sacrifice." The news sent a chill through Deborah that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Even in sanctuary, the shadow of the old compact still reached toward her daughter. She began to have nightmares again, dreams of the ritual chamber and Frank Green's ancient voice speaking words that made her soul recoil in horror. It was during one of these restless nights that Hannah began to show signs of unusual behavior. The baby, normally peaceful and content, became fretful and difficult to soothe. She would cry for hours without apparent cause, her small face contorted with what looked almost like fear. The sisters tried every remedy they knew, but nothing seemed to help. Sharon Gray was the first to notice the pattern. "It's always during the darkest hours," she observed after several nights of Hannah's distress. "Between midnight and dawn, when the old stories say the barriers between worlds are thinnest." "What are you suggesting?" Deborah asked, though she feared she already knew. "I think they're still trying to reach her," Sharon said quietly. "Not physically, they can't penetrate our walls, but spiritually, mystically. The connection they believe exists between Hannah and their old gods might allow for other forms of influence." The thought that Douglas and his followers might still be able to affect her daughter, even from a distance, filled Deborah with renewed terror. She had thought the convent's walls would provide complete protection, but it seemed the ancient powers they served recognized no such boundaries. Mother Superior Powell, when consulted about Hannah's behavior, was pragmatic in her response. "If there is indeed some form of spiritual attack being directed at the child, then we must respond with spiritual defenses. We'll begin holding special prayer vigils during the hours when she's most distressed. The combined faith of our community should be more than sufficient to protect one innocent baby." The prayer vigils began that very night, with sisters taking turns to maintain a constant presence in Deborah's chamber during the dark hours. They would sit quietly beside Hannah's cradle, speaking soft prayers and hymns, their voices creating a barrier of faith around the sleeping child. The effect was almost immediate. Hannah's nighttime distress diminished significantly, and she began sleeping peacefully through the night once again. But the vigils revealed something else. something that made even the most skeptical sisters acknowledge that supernatural forces were at work. During the deepest hours of night, when the prayers were most fervent, strange sounds could be heard from outside the convent walls. Not the normal sounds of wind and weather, but something else entirely. A rhythmic chanting in an unknown language that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sister Sharon Taylor, an elderly woman who had served at the convent for over 40 years, was the first to identify the source of the sounds. "It's the old tongue," she said during one of the community meetings where they discussed Hannah's situation. "My grandmother spoke it sometimes when she thought no one was listening. Those are words of summoning, of calling across the barriers between worlds." "You're saying they're trying to contact their gods directly?" Mother Superior Powell asked, her expression troubled. "More than contact," Sharon Taylor replied grimly. "They're trying to invoke them, to bring their presence into our world. The child represents more than just a sacrifice to them. She's a doorway, a way for the old powers to regain influence in the mortal realm." This revelation cast Hannah's situation in an even more dire light. If Douglas and his followers were attempting to use her daughter as some form of mystical gateway, then the threat went beyond simple ritual murder. They were talking about unleashing ancient evils that had been dormant for centuries, powers that could affect far more than just one small convent. As winter reached its deepest point, the sounds from outside the walls grew stronger and more persistent. The sisters maintained their vigils with increasing determination, but the strain was beginning to show. Several of the older women collapsed from exhaustion, and even the youngest were showing signs of the spiritual battle they were fighting. It was then that an unexpected ally arrived at the convent gates. A lone traveler wrapped in a heavy cloak and riding a horse that seemed barely able to stand, appeared during a particularly fierce snowstorm. When the sisters brought him inside, they discovered it was a man they recognized, though not one they had expected to see again. It was Eugene Thompson, the massive Viking warrior who had been part of Douglas's group. But the man who stood before them now was changed, diminished by something more than just the harsh winter journey. His eyes held a haunted quality, and his hands shook with more than cold as he accepted the warm ale the sisters offered. "I've come to warn you," he said without preamble, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. "Douglas has gone completely mad. The failure to obtain the child has driven him to desperate measures. He's planning something for the winter solstice, something that will endanger not just the baby, but everyone in this region." Mother Superior Powell studied the giant warrior with careful eyes. "Why should we trust you? You were part of the group that threatened this woman and her child." Eugene's massive shoulders sagged with what looked like genuine remorse. "Because I've seen what our pursuit of the old ways has cost us. Anthony Myers died protecting them, and his death opened my eyes to the evil we were serving. Benjamin Garcia felt the same way, but when he tried to leave, Douglas killed him as a traitor. I barely escaped with my own life." The news of Benjamin's death sent a chill through the assembled sisters. If Douglas was willing to kill his own followers to maintain his dark purpose, there was no limit to what he might do to achieve his goals. "What is he planning?" Deborah asked, her voice tight with fear for her daughter. Eugene looked directly at her, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "He's going to attempt the summoning ritual without the proper sacrifice. Frank Green believes that if they can channel enough power during the solstice, they can force the old ones to manifest regardless of whether they have the child or not. But the amount of energy required," he shuddered, "it will tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. Things will come through that should never be allowed in our world." The implications were staggering. Instead of abandoning their plan when they lost access to Hannah, Douglas and Frank Green were preparing to unleash something far worse than a simple ritual murder. They were talking about opening doorways between worlds, allowing entities of pure malevolence to enter the mortal realm. "Where?" Mother Superior Powell demanded. "Where are they planning to perform this ritual?" "The old stone circle about 10 miles north of here," Eugene replied. "It's a place of power that predates even the Viking settlements. Frank Green says the barriers between worlds are thinnest there, especially during the solstice." Sharon Gray spoke up from her position near Hannah's cradle. "I know that place. My grandmother used to warn children away from it, said it was cursed ground where bad things happened to anyone foolish enough to visit after dark. The ritual is planned for tomorrow night, Eugene continued, the winter solstice when the old powers are strongest. If we're going to stop them, it has to be then. A heavy silence fell over the chamber as the sisters contemplated the magnitude of what they faced. They were women of faith and learning, not warriors prepared to battle supernatural evil, but the alternative, allowing Douglas and Frank Green to proceed with their apocalyptic plan, was unthinkable. It was Mother Superior Powell who broke the silence, her voice carrying the authority and determination that had made her leader of the community. We can't allow this to happen. Whatever the risk to ourselves, we have a responsibility to protect not just Hannah, but everyone who would suffer if these ancient evils are unleashed. What can we do? Asked Sharon Gray. We're not equipped to fight sorcerers and demons. We have something more powerful than swords or sorcery, the Mother Superior replied firmly. We have faith in the combined prayers of a community dedicated to fighting evil in all its forms. If God wills it, that will be enough. As the sisters began to plan their response to the threat, Deborah found herself caught between terror and determination. Her daughter was safe within the convent walls, but if Douglas succeeded in his mad plan, nowhere would be truly safe. The ancient evils he sought to unleash would spread across the land like a plague, corrupting and destroying everything they touched. Hannah stirred in her cradle, opening her bright green eyes to look up at her mother with the innocent trust of the very young. In that moment, Deborah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months before. She would not cower behind the convent walls while others fought to protect her child's future. If this battle was to be fought, she would be part of it. The winter solstice dawned gray and bitter, with snow falling steadily from a sky the color of old pewter. The Sisters of St. Catherine's had spent the night in prayer and preparation, gathering what weapons they could find and blessing them with holy water and sacred oils. They were not warriors by training, but they understood that sometimes faith required action as well as contemplation. Eugene Thompson had provided them with detailed information about the stone circle and the ritual Douglas planned to perform. The ancient site consisted of 13 standing stones arranged in a perfect circle, with a flat altar stone at the center. According to Frank Green's knowledge of the old ways, the ritual would begin at sunset and reach its climax at the exact moment of the solstice, when the barriers between worlds would be at their weakest. Mother Superior Powell had made the difficult decision to leave most of the sisters at the convent to protect Hannah and maintain the prayer vigils that kept the child safe from spiritual attack. Only a dozen of the most capable sisters would make the journey to the stone circle, along with Eugene and, despite all protests, Deborah herself. This started because of my daughter, Deborah had insisted, when the Mother Superior tried to convince her to remain behind. If there's a chance my presence could help stop it, then I have to be there. The journey to the stone circle was treacherous, the mountain paths made nearly impassable by snow and ice. But Eugene knew the way, and the sisters were hardy women accustomed to hardship. They traveled in silence, each lost in their own prayers and preparations for what was to come. As they approached the ancient site, the snow began to fall more heavily, as if the very sky was trying to hide what was about to unfold. Through the white curtain, they could see the dark shapes of the standing stones, and the flickering light of torches that marked where Douglas and Frank Green were preparing their ritual. The two remaining cultists had not been idle during their exile from the Longhouse. They had gathered a collection of artifacts and implements that spoke of decades spent in preparation for this moment. The altar stone was covered with carved symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the torchlight, and the air around the circle hummed with an energy that made everyone's skin crawl. Frank Green stood at the center of the circle, his ancient voice rising and falling in the rhythmic chant of the old tongue. He had painted his body with symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon, and his pale eyes reflected the torchlight like those of a wild animal. The years seemed to have fallen away from him, revealing something that was no longer entirely human. Douglas paced around the perimeter of the circle, his sword drawn and ready. He had the look of a man who had staked everything on a single desperate gamble, and his eyes held the fevered intensity of fanaticism. When he spotted the approaching sisters, his face twisted into a snarl of rage and anticipation. "You're too late," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered ground. "The ritual has already begun. The old ones stir in their ancient places, ready to reclaim the world that was stolen from them." Mother Superior Powell stepped forward, her own voice ringing with authority. "In the name of God and all that is holy, I command you to cease this abomination. You play with forces beyond your understanding, powers that will destroy you along with everything else." Frank Green's chanting never faltered, but his lips curved in what might have been a smile. The symbols on the altar stone were glowing now with an inner light that had nothing to do with the torches, and the air within the circle was beginning to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer stone. "Your God is young and weak," Douglas replied, raising his sword toward the falling snow. "The powers we serve are older than your scriptures, stronger than your prayers. Tonight, the ancient compact is fulfilled in ways our ancestors never imagined." The battle that followed was unlike anything the sisters could have prepared for. It was not simply a physical confrontation between opposing forces, but a clash between different understandings of reality itself. As the sisters advanced with their blessed weapons, the very ground beneath their feet seemed to rebel against their presence. Eugene Thompson proved his worth as an ally, his massive strength and warrior skills making him a formidable opponent for Douglas. The two men fought with the desperate intensity of old comrades turned bitter enemies, their swords ringing against each other, while the supernatural energies of the ritual swirled around them. But it was the spiritual battle that proved most crucial. As Frank Green's chanting reached its climax, and the barriers between worlds began to thin, things started to appear within the stone circle. Dark shapes that hurt the mind to perceive, entities of pure malevolence that had been waiting centuries for this opportunity to enter the mortal realm. The sisters responded with prayers and hymns, their voices rising in harmony to create a barrier of faith around the ancient site. For a moment, it seemed their spiritual defenses might hold, that their combined belief could prevent the old evils from fully manifesting. But Frank Green had prepared for such opposition. With a final word of power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain, he completed his summoning. The altar stone cracked down the middle with a sound like thunder, and something vast and terrible began to push its way through the gap between worlds. It was then that Deborah made her own contribution to the battle, drawing upon the fierce protective love that had driven her to flee the Longhouse and cross the winter wilderness. She stepped forward into the circle itself. The ancient evils recoiled from her presence, not because of any mystical power she possessed, but because of the pure human emotion that surrounded her like armor. "You want my daughter," she said, her voice cutting through Frank Green's chanting like a blade. "You've pursued her across half the kingdom, killed innocent people, destroyed lives. But you can't have her. She belongs to the world of light and love, not to your darkness." The thing that was trying to push through from the other side of reality turned its attention toward her, and Deborah felt the full weight of its malevolent regard. But she stood firm, drawing strength from thoughts of Hannah sleeping safely in the convent, protected by the prayers of the sisters who had become her family. Frank Green's chanting faltered as he realized what was happening. The ritual required a willing sacrifice, a soul freely given to the old powers. But Deborah's presence in the circle, motivated by love rather than fear or desperation, was disrupting the carefully balanced energies he had spent decades learning to control. "No," he screamed, his ancient voice cracking with rage and desperation. "The compact must be fulfilled. The old ones will not be denied." But it was too late. The thing from beyond the world, denied the sacrifice it had been promised, began to withdraw back through the gap between realities. As it departed, it took something with it, something essential from Frank Green himself. The ancient cultist aged decades in moments, his body crumbling to dust as the powers he had served for so long abandoned him. Douglas, seeing his spiritual leader destroyed and his cause lost, made one final desperate attack on Eugene. But the giant warrior was ready for him, and their duel ended with Douglas's sword buried in his own chest, a victim of his own fanatical determination. As the last echoes of the supernatural storm faded away, the stone circle stood silent in the falling snow. The altar stone remained cracked, but the malevolent energies that had surrounded it were gone, banished back to whatever realm they had come from. The ancient site would never again serve as a doorway between worlds. The sisters gathered around Deborah as she knelt in the snow where Frank Green had fallen, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. The threat that had pursued her daughter across the winter landscape was finally ended, the dark compact broken by love and faith working together. "It's over," Mother Superior Powell said softly, placing a gentle hand on Deborah's shoulder. "The old evil is gone, and Hannah is safe." As they made their way back to the convent through the falling snow, Deborah thought about the future that now lay open before her and her daughter. They would remain at St. Catherine's for a while, until Hannah was older and the world beyond the mountain walls seemed less threatening. But eventually they would venture out again, carrying with them the strength that came from having faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Hannah would grow up knowing that she was loved and protected, that there were people in the world willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of innocence. She would never know how close she had come to a terrible fate, but she would benefit from the courage and faith that had saved her. The winter solstice passed into memory, and with it, the last remnants of an ancient evil that had plagued the northern lands for generations. In its place, a new story began, one of hope and renewal, of love triumphant over the darkest of purposes. And in the warm halls of the mountain convent, a baby slept peacefully, dreaming of a future bright with possibility.